Eric, why are you doing this to the people?
The people deserve it. They need it. And I'm the person who won't pull any punches.
We're kind of like the government. We know what's best for the people. We know what's best for you. And here's the thing, folks, okay? The general tagline for Iron Culture is United for All Lifters. But we're basically going to exclude a large swath of lifters because those that think if you don't train a failure, that you are a failure, you might have a wake-up call today in this episode.
I will say, though, that group of lifters have a great tagline. And I think more important than truth is whether something sounds truthy.
Sure.
And if you don't train to failure, you are a failure. Man, if that isn't memeable, if that shouldn't have like an eagle on a poster with failure written on top,
Right.
And then that written in small print below, I don't know what should be on that poster. So, yeah, like I said, I don't pull punches, Omar. And I know that some might say, and that some was me later in this episode, that the people aren't ready to hear these truths about failure training. But I know the cult is going to be ready when the time comes. And the time comes now, because it's coming right after this intro. And we got none other than FAU Master's graduate, that's Florida Atlantic University, shout out Dr. Mike Zerdos, Zach Robinson on, who actually did his master's degree, which he recently defended successfully, on the topic of training to failure for both hypertrophy and strength. You might know him from Data-Driven Strength, along with his colleagues there. They coach some high-level lifters. They are high-level thinkers, and they're just really good dudes. So I was really pleased to have Zach on because he went in on the topic of training to failure, and we took all kinds of angles. We talked about velocity decay and velocity-based training. We talked about the potential of training short of failure to actually enhance force production on average within sets for strength. We talked about the relationship between going to failure and exercise selection and going to failure and load. And we also talked about how much more ambiguous the hypertrophy training literature is compared to strength, which is actually relatively clear. So this is one that if you are someone who believes that effort is incredibly important, guess what? You're still right. However, we just need to establish where does the threshold lie where that starts to really make a big difference, and how do we use effort to our advantage so that our short-term efforts don't take precedence over our long-term efforts. So ultimately, this episode is about how do we place our high-effort training in the most appropriate way within microcycles, within sessions, and which exercise and which rep ranges we're using to make the overall aggregate output better. So ultimately, this is about, should we be training as hard as we possibly can right now, or should we be figuring out the way that we can train as hard as possible over time?
Eric, when you first pitched me this episode, introduce Zach to the audience as you introduce Zach to me.
I got this guy. I know a guy, Omar.
Okay.
He's a real failure because that's what he studies for his master's degree under Dr. Zerdos. And you looked at me and you said, Eric, it hurts my soul every time you make a joke like that.
No, and I said, hey, around here, or the people that we speak to, we recommend not to train to failure, but instead to be a failure. So I'm sure he'll fit right in. Mm-hmm. But when you introduced me to Zach of Data-Driven Strength, and I took a look at his profile, and he just started talking to me, I know Zach very differently, not from academia, not as someone, conducting some research and contributing to the greater good. I know him as a jolly bro at the gym who came up to Toronto one fine summer on spring break. He was crushing his 315 deadlifts, and I had a fantastic conversation for an hour with him when he was a 10 or 21-year-old. And then apparently, he said it went well. The training session was well, and we made a reference and a shout out to, mutual friend Alan Thrall, and that's it. I'm not like, oh, the serious researcher, Zach. I'm like, oh, that guy that was doing 315 on the weightlifting side of Fortis.
Struggling.
I didn't. Hey, look, I was going to leave that shit out and just say it was 315. My boy was deadlifting 315. And I was almost going to say it was like multiple for reps, right? It wasn't a single.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And at the tender age of 21. So that's, how long has he been lifting, folks? Now how old are you, Zach?
24.
Oh yeah, 3 years. I mean, you probably started around 135 on your deadlift when you first started. Maybe been lifting for a year and a half at that point. Assume linear progression. So what are you lifting, like 700 now?
Yeah, well, 715 last week, but pretty close.
Yeah.
Impressive stuff.
Couple
That's
more,
awesome.
couple more gallons of milk. I'll be there.
Yeah, as long as it's all day. So yes, in all seriousness, we have Zach Robinson just finished his master's under Dr. Zerdos out in Florida Atlantic University with a very relevant and timely research topic for his thesis, specifically looking at the effects of proximity to failure on hypertrophy and strength. My God, Omar, how have we not already talked about this on Iron Culture?
Man, so we've hinted at it, and certainly, Eric, you've done, I think, a fantastic job. A general overview. I think our listeners are hip to the idea that proximity to failure is a consideration when it comes to training, but how close one must be is actually probably less than some general fitness enthusiasts people would have you believe. And so we haven't gotten into the weeds with it, but this is a perfect opportunity to do so, because what do you know, at the cult, we're just always leading the charge. There's voices out there, Eric, that say you must, in fact, if you don't train to failure, you're basically not getting effective training. And of course, there's far more nuance amongst the Iron Culture dome or pyramid, whatever we want to say. So it felt that we didn't need to hash over the topic, but actually, I think it will be very much needed, because I think even those that might be in the know will be quite surprised with the findings as it relates to proximity to failure for hypertrophy and also for strength.
Absolutely. And we're not going to bury the lead here, folks. We're going to get right to the heart of, I think, where there is definitely some animosity in the community. So I'm going to use a story to tell an analogy about another story to talk about this topic. And that'll make sense in about 6 minutes from now. So I remember a few years ago, maybe 3 or 4, I was having a discussion, and I don't mean to stereotype, with a much older person than I, and it turned political. And so they were more conservative than I. Again, not a stereotype, just the facts of the matter. I'm just describing the situation so you can picture it in your head. And they were talking about the problems of illegal immigration in the United States. And this was after I had been living in New Zealand for a while, and I tried to politely describe how my experiences with what it takes to become a permanent resident in another country outside the United States. And they were like, wow, that sounds really difficult. And I was like, yeah, and it's about 35 times that difficult to do it in the United States. To get actually a green card can take sometimes decades. And, perhaps if we had a system that, had a more straightforward pathway to becoming a legal immigrant, perhaps that would curtail the illegal immigration. And the response to me saying, oh, well, if we don't want so much illegal immigration, why don't we make the legal pathway more reasonable, was a general shaking of the head and say, people aren't ready for that. Like this person acknowledged it was a good idea, but she just thought, you know what, if you pitch this to the people, like, let's make it easier to immigrate, people aren't ready for that. Which made me realize that the real heart of the issue is not whether it was illegal or legal immigration, just immigration in general. So anyway, and I know I lost some followers, and it is what it is, but that's fine. Fast forward to only a few months ago, I'm having a talk with none other than your fellow Canadian, Jeff Nippert. You might have seen a recent video he did where he went to the different levels of complexity on what stimulates hypertrophy. At the very basic level, eat protein and lift hard. And then he got all the way to the point where he's talking about the mechanistic target of rapamycin and all the good stuff, different pathways and mechanotransduction. So anyway, he contacted like real researchers to do that hardcore stuff, but for like level 4 or 5, he got an applied S&C guy like me. But he was talking to smart people like Andrew Vygotsky and others for the higher level stuff. So anyway, when we started talking about proximity to failure, Jeff was like, all right, so, where are we at with that? Here's the systematic review. It says we need to be within 2 to 3 reps. And I said, well, actually, if we really look at the research, maybe you can be 5 or more reps from failure and get a similar response if you have matched volume, at least in the muscle groups we measure, some of the prime movers. And Jeff's response, I had a flashback to years before that said, yeah, you're probably right, Eric, but people aren't ready for that. And he's right, because the issue is not actually, the reason why there's animosity is not because people have debates about the data and the proximity to failure, it's because you are picking at the heart of what it is to be a hardcore bro when you suggest that you should be holding yourself back and not crushing it every day. And you get these very visceral emotional reactions when you talk about this stuff. And again, so I didn't bury the lead, but what I will say is that just to regain my bro card, and for anyone who is about to, swipe off and watch a different YouTube channel instead of this, just to get back to their hardcore roots, let me just say the whole reason we care about proximity to failure is not because we want training to be easier today, but because we want overall training to be more effective, which means that the total area under the curve will probably actually be harder because we're putting forth more effort. So it's about, how do I make the decision today on this specific movement on this day of the week based on what I did the day prior, what I'm doing the day tomorrow, what I'm going to do next week, so that I can get optimal results. So we're just being hardcore with maybe a slightly longer view to the mid and long-term future. And if you can hang with me on that, I promise you'll make it through this conversation without throwing your protein shake at the screen, and we'll be able to actually say something other than go hard or go home. We want you to go hard as you can and then go home so you can come back another day. It's a slightly longer catchphrase, but I think it's going to catch on. Do you agree, Omar?
Eric, let me just say that was brilliant, the comparison. And it almost, I think the self-censorship that potentially occurs within people, they're not ready for that. It's like, what, the people aren't ready for the truth? That it's so far away from what they're used to? No, we give the full Monty around here, okay? That's why we brought on Zach, because we know they're ready. Sometimes, using that Plato analogy of the cave, they think it's going to be blinding. Oh, they're not going to be ready for what? Proximity failure? You could have 5 reps in the tank and you're going to make gains? No, the cult is ready. That's why we brought on Zach.
That's right. And again, just to keep getting the bona fides out there. So like I said, Zach, deadlifting well over 700 pounds, linear gains since he lifted 315 as a 21-year-old. In addition, has a master's degree. But no, in all seriousness, he's actually starting his PhD at FAU, also under Dr. Zerdos. Although it's early days for the PhD, he was mentioning off air that he probably wants to keep researching this topic. And I find it really interesting, just academically, the concept of failure, because there's so many different reasons that someone might hit failure. And it obviously aligns with what I did for my PhD and a lot of the work that is being done at FAU, where we're asking people to rate RPE, which is fundamentally the same thing as gauging how far from failure am I. And that in and of itself is a subject of debate, which we've talked about in Iron Culture. So anyway, Zach, we're going to let you talk a little bit more now, which we eventually do on Iron Culture when we have guests. Tell us more about, why did you decide that you wanted to study this for your master's, and what led you to this topic?
Yeah, it's actually a pretty interesting story. I think it kind of started with, I think you guys are both familiar with, Chris Beardsley had an awesome kind of series of articles that kind of discussed what he called at the time the effective reps kind of model, or stimulating reps model. And that was, the kind of the conversation has shifted over time of how do we quantify training volume for hypertrophy. Kind of started with the Wernbaum meta-analyses as number of reps just in aggregate over the week, kind of shifted towards more commonly the hard sets model as of now. But then you get the kind of the crossover people that, also do kind of powerlifting style training, doing a ton of sets under 6 repetitions. And they're like, well, we usually don't count this as a hard set in kind of the traditional way that we do it. And that's confirmed with that recent meta-analysis by Bosval. Sets under 6 reps aren't really counted as a hard set because it's not long enough. So it's like, what do we do with that training volume now? Do we count those reps? Do we also count sets? How do we kind of bring all this picture together? So, a ton of credit to Chris Beardsley. He does a ton of good work, especially kind of taking the mechanistic data and trying to make that make sense from a modeling perspective. And he kind of came up with this effective reps model to explain a lot of this early data of, okay, we have one group that takes 80% of 1RM and trains to failure, and another group that takes 30% of 1RMs and trains to failure. And we see similar hypertrophy. Originally, we're like, okay, they're both doing the same amount of sets. But as I mentioned, when we start adding caveats of lower rep sets, not training as far to failure, how do we kind of put all that stuff together? And so Chris's model, I found that and I read it and I was like, this is really interesting. I find the proximity to failure topic in general just really cool. So I started, reading all the individual studies myself. And then obviously Greg wrote an awesome additional article to talk about the same topic. And yeah, I just started to come to realize that the entire body of literature is a lot more complicated than I think a lot of the conversations around this topic are. Now, I want to be very clear. I think there are a ton of good reasons for the current recommendations in terms of practicality, and we can probably touch on that in a little bit. But I think from like a purely scientific perspective, kind of the common notion is, you want to terminate a set with 0 to 4 RIR to be quote unquote effective, or quote unquote actually count as training volume. I would probably question that from a purely scientific perspective, but again, we might get into the actual practicality of those recommendations. I think, Eric, you've talked about this for your books. You're not writing your books in terms of people are going to interpret this perfectly and literally. You have to kind of have some grace with the people that are reading it and interpreting the guidelines when you're kind of putting that out there. So I think from that perspective, I think kind of the 0 to 4 RIR is probably a good thing. And again, we can touch on this in more detail depending on where you guys want to go. But yeah, that's kind of how I got here, I think.
I think that's a great preamble. And I actually want to get into what might seem like a nuanced topic, but I think will open a lot of doors for us. And, part of the reason, so if you look at my books, and I love the word grace. It's basically saying my audience is human. I'm not just going to give them the facts. I need to think about how I'm speaking to them in the way that's going to result in the optimal communication for the largest number of people who are likely to buy my books. Hard thing to do. I don't always get it right. And I'm not criticizing those who take a more, look, you know what? You deal with the information, but here it is. I think that's an understandable thing to do, especially if maybe you're stronger on the analytical side and not as great on the communication side. We all have strengths and weaknesses. So anyway, in my books, I basically say, hey, a set counts if it's a 5 to 10 RPE, which for those listening is basically a 0 to 5 RIR. The decision to do that, however, was not based on data that suggests that if you go past a 5 RIR to 6 or 7 RIR, it's less effective. Rather, it was based on the data I had available at the time on RIR accuracy that came out of Daniel Hackett's lab in Sydney. And there are some studies that were done in 2017 and 2018 that showed once you got in trained individuals, not powerlifters, because I'm thinking, not everyone who buys my book is going to be trying to place top 10 in USAPL Nationals or get their pro card. When you look at people who are even doing the leg press and the machine press, which are arguably easier things to gauge, there's less degrees of freedom on how that movement is carried out. Once you get past 5 RIR, the accuracy of their RIR ratings drops off pretty substantial, or I should say significantly. So I went, you know what? That's a useful way of me saying where we should cut this off, because not that I think it's less effective, but that I don't have confidence in your ability to gauge that proximity to failure. So this is essentially the scientific problem applied in the real world of gauging the noise in our measurement versus the actual knowledge of what. This is why we need sufficient sample size, not only so it's representative, but we need to ensure that we have the good signal to noise ratio. Like if my DEXA scanner has a 2 to 3% error in body fat percentage, it's not a good idea for me to measure my body fat every week because I'm expecting less than a 2 to 3% change. So it's the same concept applied to RPE. So Zach, I wonder what your thoughts are on that, and how much do you think just the accuracy of someone's ability to gauge proximity to failure is something that must be considered rather than, say, like the velocity-based research where we actually have an objective way of quantifying proximity to failure?
That is the exact reason why I think the practical recommendations versus kind of the theoretical ideas are somewhat different. I think to even kind of wind the clock back a bit further, what proximity to failure or rating your RP or RIR presupposes is that we have a very clear definition of what failure is. And that's a huge problem in the literature throughout the entire body. And Dr. James Steele and Dr. James Fisher have wrote a ton about this, and I think they're kind of in their own corner in the research, yelling at everybody like, guys, we've been talking about this for years. We have to standardize the way that we are defining these terms. So just to put this in a really simple, practical example, you'll have a lot of people that train in the gym. Let's say you're squatting by yourself. What you're going to call failure or 0 reps in reserve in that instance is probably going to be some type of technical failure. You probably don't want to dump the bar on the pins in most cases, especially if you're squatting heavy. Now, the the most defensible definition in the research, probably that's the least ambiguous, is probably momentary muscular failure, which is despite maximal effort to complete this repetition, I cannot do so. Which even for multi-joint exercise is a little bit fishy because, like you said, Eric, with the shifting of loading demands, things get a little bit weird. In a squat, you start to good morning it. Is that a failure? You know, it gets a little bit gray. But the point is, that is a problem within itself. When we say RPE or we say RIR, that is referencing what zero RIR is in the first place. So we have to be very clear with our definitions, even when we're talking about RIR accuracy. And so when you get into the example of somebody who hasn't trained, especially with kind of the more recent crowd of lifters that have come up with a lot of the information saying you don't need to train to failure, they probably haven't had that experience in the gym where they're doing, you know, incline bench, flat bench, decline bench, all the same with dumbbells and flies for 3 to 4 sets, every single one of them till I'm, you know, blue in the face and can't complete another repetition. I think we've all done that at one point in our lives. And that is a good reference for the rest of your career to, okay, that's what failure is. So when I say RP or when I say RAR, that's the point I'm referencing. Whereas, you know, in today's kind of lifting culture that maybe has had a little bit better information on the whole, that maybe is a little bit less clear. So when I say zero RAR, I'm more so talking about that volitional failure point where it's, I don't think I could get another repetition, but I don't really know. So you can have a lot of proponents of training to failure, where I think that is an extremely valid criticism. If failure is not explicitly defined in a study, we don't know, even if they say it's 2 RAR, we don't know if, you know, when I'm talking to somebody in the gym, is that 2 RAR, 5 RAR, 7 RAR? We don't really know. So I think that's something definitely consider before we kind of move on from there. So I think that's part of the accuracy equation to keep in mind.
Well, it sounds like your dog is a bro and is not happy with what you brought up. The only kind of failure is actually missing a rep. So no, don't apologize. It's just funny. And it's really on the audio side. I promise you, Brandon, it's not going to be hard to deal with. Okay. But we expect to hear no dog barking. I want you to edit that out and replace it with the sound of a siren. That's what our audience is used to. I'm sure that'll be fine. No, but in all seriousness, why does this matter, folks? So for example, let's say someone does a meta-analysis on training to failure, which has been done. And we can talk about those results in a moment. But imagine that in that study, you have people who are training to failure, volitional failure, at 75% of 1RM on a compound lower body movement. And then you also have in that study people who are training to momentary muscular failure in, let's say, Steele and Fisher's lab, doing, say, an upper body machine movement. I would put forth that the latter would be to what we would call an 11 RPE. They are actually getting stuck mid-rep and stopping. While the former, and again, I said 75% of 1RM, that's probably going to give most people 10 to 12 reps on, let's say, a squat. That means that they're going to be stopping at what they perceive to be a 10 RPE, which based on the data we have out of Dr. Zerlis' lab and others, means they're probably stopping at a 0 to 2 RIR or an 8 to 10 RPE, with some people on that standard deviation getting down to a 6 or 7. So you're effectively comparing a 2 RIR to a negative 1 RIR in that scenario. So I think that's something to consider. And it does certainly muddy the waters a little bit when it comes to actually determining where does where does it start to matter. Going back to effective reps, I'm really glad you brought that up, and shout out to Chris Beardsley. I think this is a very common thing that we see in the quote-unquote evidence-based community. I don't expect the average person who values scientific data to inform their training to read a whole bunch of primary research. And I think what is much more common is they find people who are good at reading it, analyzing it, and who create models, infographics, articles, blogs, like myself, podcasts, based on it. And if there is a relatively straightforward example or explanation or model or system that comes from it, that is probably going to catch a lot more fire, popularity, and utility. Here's a good example. The concepts of MAV, MEV, and MRV that Dr. Mike Israetelis brought up, your volume landmarks. Those are real things, don't get me wrong. However, I think when some people want to say, oh, I've seen some estimations on number of sets around that, I want these to be far more precise than even Mike intended, to give him credit. I'm not saying he's doing anything that, he's not like pretending that he knows that 14 sets is best for everyone on average for chest. But the reality is that so many things change that. There's so much volatility in those numbers based on the individual, prior training, current status, and there's so much noise in actually assessing that just because of the biopsychosocial reality that we operate in, that actually identifying where the MRV, MAV, and MEV are is actually a lot harder than I think most people who use those landmarks think it is. Still a useful concept. Same kind of thing is true with effective reps. I do believe that each movement and person has a range where the reps are effective. I don't think it is black and white such that it is not effective prior to that, and it's effective once you start doing them. It's almost certainly this kind of gradated thing, and it's on a continuum. But classic quote from the statistician George Box: all models are wrong, but some models are useful. And I would put forth that even though there's a whole bunch of data that suggests the strict interpretation of the effective reps model of once you get to a 5 RIR, those reps count and nothing else does, I think it's completely wrong and discounted by so much data, but I think it's still a useful model because it must exist
100%.
somewhere, right? I don't know if you agree with that, Zach, that like we must have to care about the proximity to failure at some point, because technically, like I'm contracting my arm right now, like my tricep by waving my hand around like some type of fool. But how many more times would I have to do that before my tricep reached failure and I actually got a muscular stimulus? A lot more probably, or we wouldn't need to lift weights, right? So obviously it matters. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, and how do we attack this problem?
100%. Yeah, I was going to echo that as soon as you were done. I think, Beardsley's model, I think, was super, super helpful to get people to realize a lot of the other training variables that we utilize are important somewhat because they influence proximity to failure.
Yes.
You just go back to the age-old question of like, do you need to lift heavy to grow muscle? Obviously, that's somewhat common knowledge now that you don't need to do that necessarily. But back in the day, that was pretty controversial, and that got people to realize that it's probably the objective effort that matters rather than necessarily the heavy load, and got people to kind of look at intensity in those two different departments, load versus effort. So I think that is a hugely important part of that model. And I think, to be clear, I'm almost certain that Chris has since wrote some other articles that kind of have made it a little bit less black and white. So I know he's extremely open to the evidence. So I'm sure he's kind of started to change his mind as the very strict model, like you said, doesn't perform super well if we use to predict the outcomes of like a pure training to failure study. So that's an easy example. But yeah, no, I totally agree. It's extremely useful. But as you mentioned, I do think there are a ton of other factors that go into this equation of, okay, how far from failure can I train to maximize progress? For an outcome, I think strength and hypertrophy are different. B, I think the loading range matters a ton. C, I also think how explosively you're moving a contraction in reference to how fast you can move it also matters. And then there's a bunch of other downstream things in terms of preference and also individual fatigability, stuff like that. I think all of those dominoes kind of fall in the direction of saying it's a bit more complicated than just say 2 to 3 RIR and you'll be fine. I think it's a little bit more complicated, and depending on the overall structure of your training week, like you said earlier, Eric, I think that's where you start to figure out, okay, in this situation, compound movement, it's my third session of the week with heavy loads. It kind of starts to add a little bit more color about what might be reasonable in that instance.
That's a fantastic summary and a little bit of just kind of letting people see the whole buffet table that we're dealing with. And now we can actually start, focusing on things. I don't know about you guys. When I hit a buffet table, I get my salad first, and then I get some carbs, and I make sure I'm leaving enough room for the protein thing. So we're gonna follow that same pattern of one thing at a time. So we're not just bouncing all over the buffet table like some kind of anarchist. So let's start with strength. Okay. I think it is fantastic that you decided to study this at FAU, because if someone had a very kind of narrow view of the conversation of effort and load and proximity to failure and intensity kind of being just all one thing, they would be very confused by the enigma that is Dr. Zerdos. And the reason I say this is, for subscribers of Mass, you will be aware that there's been a long-standing debate between him and Greg Nuckols as to what is the proximity to failure that will make a difference for hypertrophy. And I think the reason why that debate can even exist is because the data is ambiguous, but Dr. Zerdos leans on the side of, you know what, I honestly think like a 4 to 5 RPE is probably going to be sufficient in most cases. While Greg is just like, I just don't see that being sufficient. And they both have, their data that they're emphasized a little more. It's not clear, but what have you. Now, the thing is you would not expect for a man to be cool with 4 to 5 RPE training if you looked at the history of Dr. Zerdos' training. This is someone who for more than 4 months has done a single at a 9.5 to a 10 RPE, occasionally missing on squats every day.
Sometimes twice a day.
Which is just, I didn't even want to tell them. People aren't ready for that, Zach.
Right.
So to quote the earlier story. So yeah, and he's the only one who's published a study on daily 1RM training. And this is a really, really interesting thing because if you look at it narrowly, you're training to a 9.5 and a 10 RPE, right? So you're training to failure every day. However, if you then read other work that Dr. Zerdos has written about proximity to failure, he says, hey, we need to stay short of failure, targeted movements, targeted times on certain days of the week so that the fatigue from it doesn't prevent you from training effectively in, say, 48 to 72 hours. So you need to properly allocate training stress, volume, and proximity to failure to get the most out of your microcycle and subsequently your mesocycle. And I think that's a great differentiator in the utility of using different proximities to failures because you can see that doing a single at a 9.5 to 10 RPE, I'm not saying it doesn't produce fatigue, but it doesn't produce muscle damage that interferes the ability to then do something the next day. While doing 3 sets of a 10 RM is a very different animal. So let's talk about the difference between effort and load and where proximity to failure comes into this for the purposes of strength and kind of your general thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think strength is probably a little bit more clear in my opinion than hypertrophy is. And so the way I kind of like to break this down is primarily through the principle of specificity. So just like we mentioned, Dr. Zerdos' experiment with a ton of daily max training. The whole reason he did that is because doing those singles at a 9 to 9.5 RPE is extremely specific for strength. And if we look at over the course of the literature, joint angle, contraction type, load on the bar, velocity, when strength is specific, you seem to have the best carryover. So if you're training with what you're ultimately trying to get better at, that seems to be what's the most efficient for results. So in my opinion, when we're talking about the area of proximity to failure, you kind of have 2 components when you're training for strength. You have these exposures that you are essentially trying to practice for the test. You're improving your neuromuscular efficiency with heavy weights, your confidence, all that good stuff. And that's what I'll just call your heavy exposure side of the thing. And obviously, as you get closer to 1RM loads, you're going to have an increase in RP or increase in proximity to failure by definition. You have to. It's inevitable. Now, when we construct the rest of our training program, the thought in our mind for strength, at least in my opinion, in the short to moderate term, should be, okay, I probably want some additional training volume for additional practice, maybe hypertrophy in a short time scale, maybe that's debatable, all that good stuff. But I want to make sure that's configured in a way that doesn't impact what ultimately is probably going to provide the majority of the bang for my buck for strength, which is going to be those heavy exposures rather than doing back offs at 15 RM loads. So the way that I view that is, okay, I'm going to set my frequency for these heavy exposures that I'm probably going to primarily rely on for the strength response, and that's going to be configured in a way for the individual. But from there, when I'm setting up the volume work, it's, okay, from a logical perspective, what's going to allow me to maximize performance on these sets that actually are going to drive the strength response? Probably staying a little bit shy from failure. And obviously, this isn't a groundbreaking kind of thought process. Boris Shako has done this for a long time. Dietmar Wolf is another one, a Norwegian powerlifting coach who's done a ton of stuff with very, very far proximities from failure for strength. But I think, in my opinion, the way that I kind of view it from a model perspective, like we discussed, when you decide whatever load you're going to use, because obviously, it would make sense to just do 20 max singles for strength if we're only talking about the principle of specificity, but you do need to have some volume work in there for the variety of reasons I mentioned. So once you've decided what load you're going to use, let's just say 80%. From there, it's, okay, what does the data say that we can train as far from failure and still maximize our results from hypertrophy and strength? And from my opinion, so long as the load seems to be heavier than 75 to 80% of 1RM, and you're using maximal concentric intent, which essentially means when I'm doing the repetition, I'm moving it as fast as I can. That seems to provide a majority of the strength stimulus, essentially, no matter where you stop the set. We have some of the velocity loss literature that we might talk about in a bit, but essentially they have these people terminating sets extremely far from failure. And even when repetition training volume isn't equated, they seem about the same strength gains. So in my opinion, for strength, you can stay pretty darn far away so long as you're training with those moderate to heavy loads. And again, with the context of as long as we're setting that up in a way to maximize our heavy exposures. Now, the one caveat that I'll make is that let's say we don't have those heavy exposures for some reason. Let's say that maybe somebody can't tolerate it for whatever reason, or they just don't enjoy it. Let's just say that's the case. I would say in that instance, a benefit of training with higher RPEs is another aspect of specificity, and that's getting used to extremely high exertion levels. I think that's probably best done with those heavy exposures, but in the case that you don't have those, you probably still want some exposures to high RPEs. And so that's going to have a shift in loading demands. You're going to know what it feels like to grind and not just freak out under the barbell when that happens. So I think you kind of have those two scenarios. I think, again, the heavy exposure is probably the route I would recommend for most people. But if that's not the case, always coming back to, being able to train some higher RPEs on those volume sets for strength, I do think have their place in the right context.
I think that was really well said. And Omar, this is something I just to give a little more respect on Dr. Zerdos's name. Back when he did that, I want to say he actually collected the data in 2013. It was a while before he published the Daily 1RM study. Because he does so much work with his master students, he's always kind of got this backlog of data. But I talked to him in Australia, and he was sharing some of the conference abstracts that came from this pre-publication of the actual article. And he was saying if I had to pick one or the other, the top singles or the back-off work, of course it's the back-off work. Because this was an era where I would say even more than now, people were really, really on the volume train. And they were looking at the relationships between volume and strength and volume and hypertrophy. And I think there was much more of this marriage between the concepts. Like if you're getting stronger, getting bigger, if you're getting bigger, getting stronger, same thing. 2013, shout out for the win. We've got pro natural bodybuilders doing DUP with 1 to 3 reps all the time. Nobody got hurt. Everything is
simpler
fine.
Time.
Yes, simpler, more hip pain time. So now, if you talk to Dr. Zerdos, the data has evolved to the point where I think he would probably take the top sets, and so would I. There's a really cool meta-analysis that came out 2017 by Ralston, and it mimics the methods of the Schoenfeld meta-analysis on hypertrophy. And while the Schoenfeld meta-analysis has this nice kind of diminishing returns, graded response of volume every time you add a set, you get a little more, and it's not much, but it's still pretty clear. Like you get 80% of your gains doing 7 sets, and probably 100% doing 10, and about 60% doing 1 to 4. Like most of us, if we have the time, would still take that diminishing returns investment. Ralston meta-analysis did not pan out that way, Omar, and I think you've probably seen this as we started when we first met. We talked a lot about the utility of singles for power builders, and hey, your back off work maybe it doesn't even need to be on the main lift if the goal is hypertrophy. I know I've experienced this in my personal injury recovery after my surgery on my hips for squats. And I've then now applied it to a lot of the rest of my lifts. I know you've experienced this, but the Ralston meta-analysis, it had to actually partition it to 5 to 12 sets, 5+ sets versus less to find a significant difference. And on compound free weight movements, it was a trivial difference. It wasn't actually even significant, or I think it was significant, but it was trivial. And it was only, I can't quite remember, but it was way, way smaller effects. And if you actually look at the percentage changes, you're getting more than 80% of the strength gains just to doing the first 1 to 4 sets. So how does that echo your own evolution, Omar, of what you've seen from kind of that top set versus back off set kind of strength perspective?
Eric, there's so much to talk about. I'm not going to derail this because I think there's going to be a very interesting meta commentary about just lifters in general, what population you fall into, who you're listening to after Zach shares all the research. But I think it's super fascinating, one, how we synced up there pretty nicely, because you were the person that basically reignited that idea when we talk about specificity when we were speaking in 2019 when you were doing your show, and we were just talking. I found it fascinating about you with the FAI and how you're doing your hypertrophy training and how you have these dual goals and all these things. And I think sometimes, Eric, you need to explore the limits and the bounds. And I could see the appeal for Zordos, the the elegance and the simplicity of squatting, doing a daily single, and just seeing what happens, and just to know this is a thing. And it doesn't surprise me, even though it's a different realm. The hypertrophy conversation from him kind of going all the way to the edge. It's like, well, how far can I take this conversation of just exposure a top single? And the very first thing he asked me, I think when we had our first podcast episode, hey Omar, I heard you did a Bulgarian style daily squats.
Yep.
Right. And then I did it with Greg, like all this stuff, Jeremy Hamilton. So we had that interesting conversation. But it's funny, the conversation about personal narratives, ego, and why we do what we do, where I had previously, and of course we can conflate these things. Oh, I'm a newbie, I'm an intermediate. Maybe that's why I was getting all these results. But I share this anecdote often about 2012, where I changed gyms, I changed training protocols, and essentially it would resemble much more that peaking program like 2019 or 2020, the training where you have the exposure to a heavy single, and then your back off work is basically maybe RP5, right? And all of a sudden, for me being just your average power builder, doing my 5x5 at RP8, like every single set was basically, I had to get hyped up the arousal. So we factor in the arousal into the RP and all these things. I was doing a whole lot more volume and thinking this is what's necessary. There's a gradual evolution of a lifter that one must do more in some sort of capacity, either higher intensity, higher proximity to failure, more total volume, all these considerations. And then we have these opportunities where maybe, I run that program and I hit an 80-pound deadlift PR. It doesn't register in my head like, hey, man, you kind of eased your foot off the gas pedal. It seems like maybe you had some results. Maybe there's something worth exploring here. A few years later, we do the things that we do. And then, I had some issues, once again, where I do think it is related, the amount of volume and then some nagging setbacks and all these other things. And then finally, your ego gets put in check where you're forced in a situation, Eric, where you spoke about before with FAI, where you're like, okay, well, maybe I got to re-examine these things. And then for myself, it was just the frustration where I thought, this is the way that things have been working, so I'm going to keep doing it. But then we had that conversation, you and I, about probabilities. Like, like if you keep squatting this way, let's say if you are able to go through the gauntlet of what you're attempting to do, there is basically, you will get a PR, but there's only about a 70% chance you're going to be able to endure all this training. So actually your chance of success is 70%. And then the question becomes, it's like, well, how specific, is doing some of that back off work? What can you do to get the results? And you and I kind of, once again, synchronizing, I found it very interesting, where you had a phenomenal powerlifting meet, and that's where it counts. I'm a pretend lifter that just does gym PRs, and you had the deadlift PR, no, but for real. And you came back from, not training specifically for powerlifting. You had the exposure to the singles. And then once again, people, the comment, and that's why it'll be for the meta conversation. But when you post some of those things, like I think Eric and Zach have like a Taylor Atwood, or I think of yourself where you post like a single and it's like, but that's it? Like that was like a 7? And then you did the back off work and like, but Eric, you could have done 5 more. Like, why did you do that? And they think it's counterintuitive. They think that you're leaving gains off of the table, whereas you're actually maximizing that which is most important, the exposure to the single, all those. But anyways, I followed a very similar pattern. Wouldn't you know it? I felt more refreshed, more recovered, was able to finally hit that squat PR from doing way less work. My readiness, general for physical preparedness to actually train on any given day was a lot higher. The satisfaction, therefore, when you got a little bit of that fatigue that's accumulating, you're like, hey, brother, another session 5x5, like RP, like truly 9. Where you have to listen to that jam in your head to get there. Just really reshape things. And so I'm glad certain things happen, Eric, that once again, we had the conversation in 2019. And then there's just ways lead on to ways. And that at the end of the day, I would say the very final thing, we're all after the similar goal, which is making progress, Like that's actually, if we can hold our egos in check, we're all united in our desire to be better, maybe get a little bit more jacked, a little bit stronger. So what's actually going to get us there? And I think having an honest conversation with oneself as to why we train, are we, chasing the demons away or what have you, is that meta conversation. But it is interesting to see, like, from being early on the scene, like we talk about power building, that graveyard of early power building, which was lucrative and appealing early on, I think we're finally seeing the totality of the consequences.
Yeah. I'm going to touch on the meta a little bit, Omar, because I really like where you went with that. And then I'll use it to actually get back to the topic of, proximity to failure for strength and bring you back in, Zach. So that graveyard, I think it comes when you actually find the target, but you don't have any nuance to it. So there was this point where we realized, like, oh shit, like the relationship between volume and hypertrophy and the relationship between intensity or I should say load and strength, that's what it is. If I have both goals, awesome. I'm going to take this bazooka and aim it at that target. And you go, I blew up the gun range. That maybe I don't need a bazooka. So that I think that's basically what happened. And now it's this question of what's the appropriate dose and which one is more important for which goal, and then how do I combine them? And I don't think we could have started there. That's just not the way it works. So to kind of illustrate the difference between proximity to failure in a strength conversation versus hypertrophy, and you alluded to this, Zach, when I talk to percentage-based trainers from a strength perspective, especially those with an Olympic lifting background, because I have a few friends like that. Shout out Stas Chileev, my Olympic lifting coach. They often see my training, like what I filter to for powerlifting, as too aggressive. Yet if you look at bodybuilders, they see my training as too easy. Mm-hmm. So the reason being is that I'll give an example. When I talk to Stas, he's like, so how many lifts have you done at 90% or over? And then I have to think like, all right, well, basically at the single at a 7 RPE is right around 90%, something you could do for 4 reps, right? So to be safe, we'll say anything where I do a single over 7.5 or higher. And I go, well, that's 1 to 2 times a week right now, and it'll get up to 2 to 3 times a week. And then it'll be every single time I squat, bench, or deadlift for my first set. And he looks at me like, why do you want to get hip surgery again? That's his response. And I think when you come from a percentage-based background, like traditionally, you just see this steady rise in percentage as you peak and a drop in volume. So when he thinks of me being 12 weeks out, training at a 90%, he thinks I'm doing 5 sets. He thinks those are like max number of repetitions, right? So I think it's this. It's really just the paradigm of where are you from. So just remember that when we're talking about proximity to failure and load, you're limiting how many RIR you can have the higher you get in load. And here's another way to think of it. Like I always like this because I think it makes people really get the difference. No one would say that 85% of 1RM is light. That is the bottom edge of what is considered moderately heavy to heavy for pretty much anyone you talk to. And if you programmed, back in 2013, singles, doubles, and triples with 85% on 1RM, that's a heavy day. But those are all at a 4 to 7 RPE, right? If you're only doing 1, 2, or 3 reps. So I think that's something that can help people understand. Like if I tell you, I did a set at 4 RPE, you would say, please put your nuts back on your body. But if I told you I did some sets at 85% on 1RM, I'd be like, oh, heavy day, bro, how'd it go? So I think that's something that I want to highlight the difference between. So it's interesting. I think, and Zach, I want to hear if you agree with this, that typically the pushback I get from using different proximities to failure, gauging RPE, and the importance of quote-unquote failure in the strength community, those arguments are typically fewer and far between, and I feel like they have less legs to stand on. You won't get people who say you need to train to failure for strength because people don't want to die on bench and squat, right? And so what you will often get instead is I'd rather use percentages because I don't like the subjectivity of RPE. And then I raise my hand and I go, bro, your sport is lifting price of right. Don't you think you should know how far from failure you are? You need to go 9 for 9 if you want to get the best total possible. So anyway, I think it's an easy argument to defeat, but I do understand it, the desire for objectivity. Do you agree with that? Do you think for strength, there's much less debate around the topic of proximity to failure?
Especially if you're speaking scientifically, I definitely think I could make a more defensible case that it's definitely not necessary. And how we define close to failure or to failure, I think, is a different conversation. But I have had a ton of conversations when we've written an article with Brian Miner about this that kind of challenged a little bit how the standard coach may view proximity to failure for strength. And it got a little bit of pushback, especially from people I respect. I know Mike T and I have had a few conversations about making sure that isn't taken off the table. Because like we said earlier, I still think that is a valuable tool, especially in certain circumstances. Because if you kind of interpret our arguments literally, it would kind of take off the table like sets of 5 at a 9 RP, which I know Mike uses a ton of with clients, and he's like, there's still value to that, and I totally agree. It's just in the right context and kind of balancing all those things out. But in general, yes, I would say that especially in the context of using those heavy lifts as well. So you still have plus 85% pretty regularly in those higher RP lifts. When you're talking about your volume work, I think it's quite a bit less controversial, that it doesn't need to be as close. And again, pointing to other anecdotes from coaches that have done this for a super, super long time, Boris Shako, Dietmar Wolf. I even think, I've talked about this a few times, I think Louis Simmons, in a way, got at exactly what I'm kind of talking about, just in a different, maybe slightly incorrect way.
DE.
Yeah, exactly. It's I think when sometimes when people hear me talk about this, they think I'm advocating for the classic speed work at 30 to 50% of 1RM, and that's not the case. Like we said, I think there is a threshold in which proximity to failure needs to meet to stimulate these adaptations. But once you're using the adequate loading range that most of us will use for strength training, which is 70 to 85% of the 1RM for the most part, I think that becomes quite a bit less relevant in most cases. So if you're doing that dynamic effort training or whatever you want to call it, it's just your volume work far from failure. And then you have your max effort lifts, which are essentially those heavy exposures, just not taking them to all the way to a 10 RPE. It's really the same thing. So I think a lot of coaches have stumbled on this in a roundabout way. We maybe just have a slightly different way of thinking about it at this point in time. So I don't think we're reinventing the wheel by any means. Maybe just kind of saying in a different way with the RPE, RER, all that good stuff.
Yeah, dude, I would say that I think there was a recent meta-analysis on velocity-based training, and for context, in velocity-based training, you're instructing the person to lift with maximal intent for speed. So already we've got a shared similarity with dynamic effort training and Westside. Also, to the Westside crowd's credit, once the raw revolution started to happen, they said, hey, like, yeah, we recommend 30 to 40% with a bunch of bands and chains for equipped lifters. But if you're a raw lifter, you probably want to be doing sets of 1 to 4 at 60 to 75% of 1RM. And what loads do they most typically use in these velocity-based training? But 75% of 1RM. And what did that meta-analysis find? That you saw some of the best strength results with a 0 to 20% velocity loss. Guess what? How many reps that is, folks? That's basically 1 to 4, maybe 5 at most. And Louis Simmons has been redeemed in the evidence-based community thanks to these researchers in Spain. Who knew it, Louis, that it would be the science-based Spanish Smith machine lifting community that would bring dynamic effort days back to raw powerlifting? But no, in all seriousness, I think that is a real eye-opener when you put it that way. And the interesting thing is, I think that Louis Simmons basically tricked people into that, making it work. Because the narrative that DE days have for improving performance is about power, which is not fully accurate in my opinion. And maybe sometimes you can make an argument around rate of force development. But honestly, I think if you think about it from the perspective of the barbell, if you take a light load and move it faster, therefore you produced more force.
More force.
Right?
Exactly.
And the only difference between your first attempt and your third attempt, if you were standing on a force plate, would be the time course. Because you're actually putting forth, most likely, when you're dealing with something that you can only do for 1 rep plus a little more load, or 1 rep plus a little less load, or your max, you're putting maximal effort forth, the bar just moves a little faster. You're going to have a 0.25 meters per second on your first attempt, a 0.21 on your second, and then a 0.17 or 1/8 on that third squat. And in all cases, you're trying to move it as fast as you can. That's why they didn't all move at 0.17. And the difference is the load on the bar, and therefore it moves slower or faster. So I think that's just a really interesting perspective for people to understand. There is something to maximal intent. So I think that needs to come into the conversation for strength as well. So is that something you coach when you have people who are training with, let's say, their back? Let's say they do, like, they're in a typical, data-driven strength BS easy set, right? So they're doing their top singlet is 7, cake, talk shit in DMs, and then they're doing 3x5 at a 5 RPE back off work. Mike T is coming in there, and Greg Doucette's coming in there. Everyone's making fun of you. Are you coaching these folks to go maximum intent with velocity?
Yeah, so real quick, I want to say this before I forget it. This is going back to Chris Beardsley. Chris Beardsley made a post that I really, really liked the way he conveyed this idea. And we'll get into the psychology of like why people want to so badly probably train close to failure. But I think he made a post contrasting RPE and RER in the context of like Borg RPE and saying that every single repetition you do for strength training should be RPE 10. And I think that's a perfect way to think about it. Effort is always maximal. the proximity to failure is separated from effort. And I think that's exactly how maximal concentric intent should be kind of brought into this conversation, because as you said, Eric, that's exactly the way we kind of looked at the proximity to failure research for strength. Powerlifting is about producing force in a specific context on the platform in the squat, bench, and deadlift for 1 repetition at a slow speed. That is what the sport is. And so when we look at it that way, this volume work, we probably, to be the most specific, also want to maximize force production. There's actually a new study out of the same Spanish labs that looked at the exact same loads. I think it was 75% of 1RM, 3 sets of 8 versus 6 sets of 4 at the exact same load, which is by definition reducing the proximity to failure. And they saw significantly greater force under the curve in the group that trained farther from failure, which is exactly what you would want to do from powerlifting from a specificity perspective, which is exactly how I think about it. And of course, it has to be within that adequate loading range like we discussed. But that is how I think about it. But yes, if we also think about maximal concentric intent and how that plays into that, just like you said, if we have 75% of 1RM on the bar, we can complete the repetition at multiple concentric speeds. If I just kind of do a 6-second tempo on the way up, that will produce 50 units of force. But if I move it with maximal effort, that's going to be more force production. And that's what we want to do to train for powerlifting ultimately. So,
by the way, if you ever want to know what 50 units of force converts to, you just need to look at the Yoda textbook for force units, and you convert them to newtons and kilos. Go ahead, though.
So as far as coaching, I think this is something that I've kind of got some more nuance to. I think, the first, like we said, thinking about a model, all of them are wrong, but some are useful. I'm like, absolutely, max intent's the way to go. Everybody's got to do it for every single repetition. If your bicep curls aren't hitting your chin, you're not doing it right. That kind of thought process. And then I had a few people, do it and it felt pretty uncomfortable, a couple tweaks, that kind of thing. So I think there's probably a happy medium to be struck there for most people. I think some exercises lend themselves to being more explosive than others as well. A common example I like to utilize is another reason why I think the exercise selection in a lot of those Spanish studies is important is that on a squat, if you're actually using maximal concentric intent with like a moderate to light load, you're coming off the ground. And if that's a free weight barbell, you're probably losing balance and falling down. But in a Smith machine, you can do so, which is why I think that's another reason that line of research finds farther proximity to failures to be effective, just because of the constraints of the exercise. So I think that's something to keep in mind with these compound lifts that have more degrees of freedom, a balance component. Just probably take your foot off the gas just a little bit. But the intent, especially at the sticking point or right below it, I think should be to move it maximally. Just from a theoretical perspective. And I think we have actually there's 2 studies, but the one that's most commonly cited is by Gonzalez Badillo. One group training, with maximal intent on every rep, trying to move it as fast as they can. The other group doing about half as fast, and they saw significantly greater strength gains. There's one that's also in the squat that's like that. The caveat to that would be, I don't know if people in the real world would train with half the possible velocity. That would be pretty slow. So I don't know if there's a threshold in which, it's good enough. Probably is. So that's kind of the whole nuanced take there. But in general, I think that's the principle you start from, just like a lot of things. And then you kind of work your way back from terms of practicality of taking your foot off the gas a little bit if you need to.
No, I think that's fantastic. And I have one joke comment that is just meant to throw you off for the rest of the podcast. And then I have a real comment. One is that when you complete your PhD, I hope you keep it real for the streets and still say especially rather than especially. I want you to keep it real. All right.
Don't change.
Don't change. And then the real comment is that I think the Spanish research is limited to some degree. I actually got the pleasure and the honor of presenting at a conference in Finland with Dr. Pareja Blanco, and I saw him actually demonstrate how to do this with the Smith machine. And there is an actual pause at the bottom, making sure they hit depth, and then a hup command, and he is encouraging constantly, maximal intent to accelerate the bar. So it's interesting. And the concept of maximal intent to accelerate the bar, I think, is something that probably will maximize force production. And powerlifting is about maximizing force production, but doesn't necessarily meet the movement specificity that can occur in max lifts and powerlifting.
Absolutely.
So this is, I think, something that I saw tangentially referred to in a back and forth between you and Mike T. I
Yep.
recall you were talking about singles at, say, low RPEs, and one really interesting comment, he was like, well, if we're doing a single at a 5 RPE, why not just program 85 or 86% of 1RM? Like, this is not something, there's too much noise in that, and it probably doesn't make a difference. And which I actually agree with. Like, you don't have to do RPE when you're that far, which is interesting. And then there's also an important point that your third or even second attempt on the platform, or even in the gym with an equivalent load, is not going to look the same. Not just even a high level lifter, it's not just going to be slower than a lighter load with maximum intent velocity. You're going to get out of position. It's the nature of doing a compound movement at a high effort and high load that there's going to be some link in the chain that is weaker. So for example, I notice that low load deadlift training, even when I do maximal intent to accelerate it, doesn't seem to transfer as much to my top end deadlift strength. Because if you've ever seen me deadlift, I'm one of those rare sumo deadlifters who gets stuck at the top. And that is so positional. So I have to make sure that I do get exposures to those movements that make me grind for the last like centimeter as I drag it up the top of my thigh and just try to get out of, the Hunchback of Notre Dame position. So I think that those are two important points that people do need to realize is that, there's data to suggest you can move a load at 75% of 1RM and get some nice transfer to top end strength, but I don't think that's going to necessarily transfer all the way from a movement pattern perspective to powerlifting. So I don't know what your thoughts on that are.
100%. And that's exactly, like I said, Mike and I have chatted about this a few times, and I think that is absolutely something to keep in mind. I think, the common thing to keep in mind with the scientific research, the people that are in these studies are not nearly as trained as us three. So the load or the proximity to failure that's going to mimic the demands on the platform is probably going to be a little bit different. So that's something to keep in mind for sure. But the third attempt squat and the first attempt squat probably could be considered different exercises. And I totally agree with that. I think I would just contend the point that ultimately, the reason you want a repetition to be hard for strength is because of load rather than intraset fatigue. That would just simply be my comeback, because that is maximizing force production and maximizing specificity. So it's not necessarily I'm just going to make this set hard for the sake of it, because I would also say a 10 RM at a 9 RPE is not the same lift as a third attempt at a 9 RPE. The velocity will be different. The amount of shift and loading demands will also be different. And so I think it's just important to keep in mind that all RPEs are not made equal, and especially in the context of strength. So shifting that more to be difficult because of adding load rather than just increasing the intraset fatigue, I think is what is important to think about there. And if we really just dial home that force production point, heavier loads are going to produce more force. That's ultimately what's going to happen. And if the RPE is rising because we're adding load to the bar, that's what we want to happen. So I think that's kind of the way I think about it. So a triple at a 9 RPE in terms of practice is different than doing a couple sets of 8 at a 9. So that I think that's where the nuance comes in, and saying that, and especially if you look at the fatigue associated with higher RPE sets, it's actually the opposite of what a lot of people think. It's not that heavier loads lead to a greater amount of fatigue in terms of the way we can measure it. At least there's a bunch of limitations to that. I'm sure that's another podcast, but that's the opposite than doing a set of 10 at a 9 RPE. That's probably actually going to cause more fatigue, which actually, if we think about the downstream effects of that, are going to affect your technique on the next set and the set on this next session. And there's more downstream effects of that. The point being, specificity is probably still king here, meaning when we're trying to get these high RPE sets for strength, we want it to be load mediated rather than fatigue mediated.
Couldn't agree more. Omar?
No, I was just going to say, Eric and Zach, that I find it interesting. Also, two things: the perspective of the lifter, and then obviously the power of language. And what I mean when I say that is that some people might say, oh, like intent to accelerate, whatever, maximal force production. It's like powerlifting is a low velocity sport comparative to other sports. But if you think about the perspective of the lifter, when you're given a demand onto them for them to do something, and then their ability to execute what's required of them, what do you think the quality of the actual movement would be between, hey, like do this, let's make it up 75%, you do 3 repetitions, every single repetition you want to move as fast as possible, or prescribing the good old 5x5 at 80%, where there's the machinations that occur, like the duress that that an individual undergoes. Oh, another set, like there's a lot of volume, and then just the way that you're setting it up, where because you're doing potentially so much work, you think, okay, I got to do 2 more sets, 3 more sets. I better, conserve my energy here. And your performance on any given set might suffer. So it's almost how you frame something for a lifter can also influence then how they execute it, in addition to all the conversations about load, velocity, power, and all those things. And that also reminds me, too, when you said, Eric, like we're joking, but it is the truth. The language and the ability then to communicate something to a lifter and for them to absorb it and then do that which is intended is a very powerful thing. And so even if Louis potentially got it wrong, his explanation on D, like dynamic effort, the idea like, accelerate as fast as possible, this is for power, this is for like maximal force production, and it's going to lend itself over to your 1 rep max. Like maybe if that's not technically true, but a lifter gets, okay, I'm now doing my accessories and I have an intent and I have a goal within those accessories, you'll probably execute it better than if it's just like, hey, top single, 5x5 champ, you're done. Because then they're probably not going to put the same quality into that 5x5. So I think it's really interesting, just that entire conversation.
Yeah, the one thing I just want to stick out for Louis here is I always think it's important to contextualize. He was operating on a lot less information than we have now too. So I think that's just something to keep in mind when he's like kind of generating the West Side kind of system. He was going on a little bit less information. So I still think he got a ton of principles right. It just maybe was a slightly different perspective based on the information he had at hand.
Folks, we lost some people from my politics conversation. We lost the hardcore crowd just by the nature of the topic, and now we just lost the evidence-based crowd by redeeming Louis. It's pretty much just the 3 of us talking together now, and I'm fine with that. So
we've gained the West Side supporters. The West Side.
Yeah, I mean, literally all who's left is people who hope for our jokes that come after the intro, and they're like, I'm just waiting for something about Paimon at this point. Yeah. So thank you for holding on, folks. The draperism is going to stay real. So anyway, no, I think this is a really, really fascinating discussion. I think, like I started this whole kind of preamble with, I think the strength side of the discussion is less emotionally charged, which I think is helpful. So I think it allows this kind of nuance, and I think people who are seriously interested in pushing the boundaries of their strength can hang with that. And I think, Omar, to your point, some of the power of language, belief, and identity, they shut the conversation down so early on the hypertrophy side that it's difficult to have it. And I think if you compound that with the fact of what I want to talk about next is that the hypertrophy data, I think, is more limited and more confusing. So overall, what we got right now is we got the Davies meta-analysis. Was that on hypertrophy or is that strength? No, strength. Yeah. So there's a more recent meta-analysis, I believe, that Dr. Schoenfeld was a part of. I think it was Gurgic
too.
Of course, Gurgic was a lead author. Shout out Gurgic for being on. Yozo Gurgic literally does all the meta-analyses these days. But there was no significant differences found between training to failure or not for hypertrophy, if I recall that meta-analysis correctly.
I think so, yeah.
So there's it's up for debate right now. And I think ultimately the discussion of proximity to failure becomes a discussion of whether volume or effort is more important and what gets the most area under the curve for stimulus, which I think is a really interesting conversation. And I think that's the way you can frame it to get around some of these emotional barriers is how do we set up our training to get the most effort in aggregate? So let's talk about that. Where does proximity to failure come in your mind for hypertrophy, Zach?
As you said, to kick it off, it's definitely complicated. And I think this is where you can look at the same exact picture and 2 people can come across with 2 different perspectives. I think for the most part, I would say that the hard and fast kind of recommendations like we've talked about probably are a little bit too strong in my opinion, purely scientifically speaking. Now, there is definitely a paucity of data with lower loads to say how close do we need to train to failure with those loads. So if we start with the load conversation like we just talked about, I think when you are training with those loads we talked about in the strength conversation, 75% plus or 10 RM and heavier, I think there's pretty decent evidence to say that proximity to failure doesn't seem to matter nearly as much as total volume performed. There was a really, really good study that just came out by Anderson and colleagues that for the listeners, they used a within subjects design. So they pretty much take the same exact person and put each of their two legs in the different groups. And for hypertrophy, that's a huge advantage because, one of the common critiques of exercise science research is, people have genetic variability. So you can't really say that this program is better for everyone because, we have individual A, individual B. Totally fair criticism. But what these do is they allow you to control for that genetic variability within an individual. So for hypertrophy, that's really, really a solid design. And so what they did was they used a lot of these velocity loss concepts that we talked about in the strength discussion and kind of match total volume. So the way that they changed the design, in a lot of the strength studies, they take, let's say, 3 sets. One group performs them to a 40% velocity loss threshold, so they'd be training closer to failure, versus another group that terminates at a lower velocity loss threshold, way farther from failure. But the problem with that is that total repetitions are not equated in that example. So group A maybe is performing throughout a week 100 total repetitions, but the other group's only performing 50 or something like that. So that's a confounder. Is it the proximity to failure, or is it the total volume that's leading to the disparity in outcomes? What this study did is they had one leg that was training closer to failure and higher velocity loss, and the other leg that trained farther from failure and lower velocity loss, but they had the lower velocity loss leg perform more sets to equate all of those repetitions. Now, directly quantifying the proximity to failure is going to be difficult. A, like some of the issues we mentioned earlier, failure wasn't defined super well. And B, velocity loss is both exercise and load specific, just meaning we can't say exactly what the proximity to failure was, but we can probably estimate fairly reasonably that the group training with the higher velocity loss was about 0 to 4 RER, kind of the standard recommendations, and the other group was 5+. And when they equated the total repetition volume, exactly the same hypertrophy. And actually, the percent changes were actually in favor of the group training farther from failure, but I don't really view that as a win for that group necessarily. A couple
Real
important
quick,
go for it.
Just I think that I just want to make sure we don't lose anybody because we talked about velocity loss a number of times without actually going, what the hell is that? So if I do a set, my first rep on a set of, let's say, 10 to failure might be at like 0.5 meters per second. And if we say a 10% velocity loss, that means I keep going until I get to 0.45 meters per second. That's a 10% loss. If it was a 50% velocity loss, I'd be going all the way down to 0.25 meters per second, which would be really close to failure, while that 10% would be super far from it. Carry on, sir.
Yeah, so a few important considerations for that study that I think are important to how we kind of contextualize the rest of the research. 2 things. 1, they used 75 to 80% of 1RM, which is the exact range that we just talked about. And 2, they used maximal concentric intent. So in my opinion, when those pieces are in place, heavy loads, heavy to moderate loads, and maximal concentric intent, hypertrophy seems to be about similar so long as volume is equated. Now, when we get to some of these other studies, a classic one is by Goto and colleagues, which they sound like double the muscle growth in a group training closer to failure than one training relatively far from failure. I think some of those factors start to be an issue. And another one is the training population. And I'm kind of going off the rails here, but I'm going to let you guys bring it back. That's the most important thing, though, when we're talking about load. When loads are heavy enough, it doesn't seem that proximity to failure matters quite as much as total volume accumulated. But the farther we go down this loading spectrum, although there's not strong evidence to say this, I think that's where proximity to failure comes kind of increasingly more important on a spectrum, is kind of the way I would view the issue.
Yeah, and I think if I recall correctly, Goto, they had a back offset that was like 30% of 1RM or something like that.
I think Goto was an interset rest study, if I recall correctly.
There's a couple of Gotos, so I might be misremembering. But yeah, this is actually something I've thought about for a long time. I don't know if I always had the right narrative about it, but I was looking at some of the EMG research, where when you're doing around, depending on the movement, 80 to 90% of 1RM, or technically based on EMG, it's not always percentage of 1RM, but okay, there is some data where you're around 80 to 90% of your load, and we start to see a plateau in the EMG response, which makes me think like, not that EMG is the same as a stand-in for force production, but there's going to be some overlap there for sure. Like if we're already at max, I shouldn't say motor unit recruitment because we don't know that for sure. When we're at max myoelectric activity,
there you go.
We're probably also at very high force production. And we're probably not moving the bar that fast at that point anyway, if we're talking about a load around 80 to 85% of 1RM. So if we want to kind of think of it from that effective reps perspective, all those reps kind of count, right? However, if we start with a load that's 40%, we probably need to get to something like a few reps from failure to really make that work. And what we know, what we talked about early on in this podcast, where the accuracy of your RIR estimation gets worse and worse and worse the more reps you do, we start to see some practical issues that combine with these mechanistic issues where I think low load training probably does need to be taken closer to failure, and it's more likely to be ineffective in the real world because you can't quite gauge that very well. So I think hopefully that ties a bow on at least the load portion, to where once you start training with moderate to heavy loads, and again, this is why powerlifters typically aren't small, in my opinion, and you see some pretty ridiculous development, especially in the prime movers for the big three, is because that's when proximity to failure doesn't matter, because you start reasonably close to failure from the outset. Is that a good summary, Zach?
100%. Yeah, that's exactly the way I view it, is kind of once you get to that threshold of those effective reps, that would just kind of, if we're talking about it from a model perspective, just seems to be farther than we maybe initially thought. Then the kind of a rep seems to be a rep for hypertrophy. Kind of, as long as you're in that recruitment threshold, you're kind of good to go. But then once you start getting farther away in terms of load and proximity to failure, especially for practical reasons, like you said, and I just said especially again, whoops.
I got him, Omar. You see that?
Got to keep him humble.
That's where
anytime you find someone who could be more intelligent than you in the long run, you have to plant the seeds of their destruction
of
early
insecurity
on if you want to maintain your spot. Yeah.
And the pecking
It's not
order.
going to be you and him on the top of this pyramid, my friend.
Well, hey, let me just say,
you forever,
Eric. So I pile on with you because you're my boy. So no matter what you say, I got your back, no matter what. But don't think I don't know, Zach, what you're doing this entire episode, because I set up the scene of the slaughter, which was I said you did 315 on the deadlifts. And I didn't say what intensity, what speed, but it was clear by the way that Eric was chiding you that it wasn't quite intense. So you thought, all right, like, fuck my master's thesis. Let me just reframe everything by saying, like, like proximity to failure doesn't really matter either for strength or hypertrophy. Let me give you a whole narrative. And we went down this entire rabbit hole of saying it doesn't matter, that was precipitated basically by me observing your, in reality, actual set of 315 being at an RP5. So this is incredible.
Nihilism is the journey.
The only philosophy that's real. Not that I care. So anyway, yeah, sorry, we totally interrupted you. Sounds like that's a good summary, but yeah, so load is a heavy mediator for hypertrophy work of how much proximity to failure matters. So I think when we're talking about moderate to heavy loads, maybe it just doesn't matter quite as much. However, and this is where the curveball. You go ahead. I'll throw the curveball.
I was going to say, if you want to bring in a few of the huge limitations that we definitely need answered. So I think
that's the curveball. It's coming.
I'm pretty confident saying what I said for, like you said, the muscles we traditionally measure. And
don't you do it. I want to throw the curveball. Don't you throw it for me.
And the sites that we traditionally measure. So what I mean by that is, kind of a standard hypertrophy study is, you have a couple training groups, they train. Let's say you're measuring quad growth and we're performing ultrasound scans on somebody's quads. Traditionally, you're going to measure that in one location. Let's just say straight across the middle, rectus femoris, let's just say. We don't really know, if we're performing squat training, if a given proximity to failure is going to cause the same hypertrophy along that entire length of that muscle the same, or if your glutes are going to grow the same. We also don't know that. So regional hypertrophy and synergistic hypertrophy both seem to kind of matter in this conversation. And I think an additional one that's kind of in the realm of this is like if you're going to use tempo to artificially make a certain part of the range of motion more difficult, that also might impact the proximity to failure that you'd want to train at. So I think all of those things, just to say, we're pretty confident if you squat, the kind of the meaty part of your squat, the quad that you're kind of mostly trying to grow, seems to be getting a sufficient stimulus. But it might be the case, and the bro wisdom might come back around to bite us here in a few years as we measure kind of more sites of the quad. So maybe a little bit farther towards your knee and a little bit farther up towards your hip. And actually, a study that Eric was a part of recently by Davies et al. kind of looked at a design pretty similar to this. One group training pretty close to failure with 85% 1RM. The other group took little mini rest periods between every single rep of that set, which in effect is going to make those kind of mini sets farther from failure. And they saw significantly greater chest growth at one site of the pecs and a pretty decent effect size at another site of the pecs. Now, I think you could spin that results two ways. We only saw one of three sites significantly different, so proximity to failure doesn't matter. Or you could take an additional view. We saw one significant difference and an effect size, so it seems to matter in some sites of the pecs. Point being, we're pretty confident, kind of an overarching principle, but some of the finer details in terms of, okay, when I bench press, do I need to train close to failure to maximize hypertrophy of my entire pec? And what's it doing for my triceps if I'm only training at a 5 RPE?
I think that's fantastic. And I'm happy you threw the curveball because you threw it just as well as I would have, if not better. And I think this is not only throwing a curveball into the whole idea of how close to failure you need to be, it's also throwing a bone to the people who just swear anecdotally that 100%. Being closer to failure works better. And I think this actually goes all the way back to what we were saying earlier about strength, that a set, your first attempt and your third attempt are arguably different movements. So the mere fact that when you go close to failure, you change positions and it alters your biomechanics means that there must be different muscular demands when you go closer to failure. And you could make that argument intramuscularly within the same muscle group or prime mover. You can make that argument for the synergists as well. And I think that is something that is by far the biggest limitation when we look at this. Because like Zach said, when we do hypertrophy research, like right now, we've got a study on weight gain going on at AUT, and we are currently measuring a couple of sites, upper body and lower body. However, the protocol is a full body hypertrophy program. So if the difference, not that there's actually a difference in the training, it's a nutritional intervention, but let's say this was a protocol where we used, let's say, chest press and leg extensions versus squat and bench press. I would expect similar pec and quad growth in those two studies, but if we measured overall lean body mass or a whole bunch of different sites, I would actually guess that, of course, the free weight compounds would probably produce more aggregate growth because there's much more synergist involvement. You have to balance the load. You're going to see more co-activation and synergist activation in such a design. So I think that's something that we really need to be aware of, is that there's this saying in quantitative research that if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. Of course, that's not true because we're limited by what we measure. If we took that perspective and applied it to the science we had in 1890, guess what? We didn't have quantum physics at that point because we couldn't measure it, so it didn't exist. But it was real. So I think that same problem could be what's going on here, is that a lot of the tools we have for measuring total body muscle growth are not as sensitive. Going back to DEXA, that can measure total lean body mass, but the error rate on that, I think, would be enough to where that chest press and leg extension study might not actually show up as being different, even if it actually was, if we had more precision to that bench press and squat study. So even going all the way back to like 70s, 60s, 50s bodybuilding wisdom, in phases when you're in a quote unquote mass building phase, and I don't even mean like massing and cutting, I mean like the old school concept of massing and then developing more definition in certain areas and specializing. Movements like deadlifts, presses, pulls, and squats are dominating the massing phase. There's far less isolation movements. And I think the idea is that you're trying to build like a foundation of strength. And I'm sorry, it's foundation of size. So, and this is really common in most like hypertrophy programs that aren't considered bodybuilding programs. Like if you want to get a whole bunch of linemen just bigger, you don't spend a whole lot of time doing rope one-arm pushdowns, right? You spend your time doing those big movements because we just want overall size. We want bigger people. So I think that is really something we have to consider, that if we're only measuring one specific small site on the pec, maybe the bicep as well, and then maybe one head of the quad, just the VL, at one location at 70% of the way down the leg, we might be missing out on a lot of what could be happening when you train to failure, when you're forcing different aspects of the muscle to contribute more because others have fatigued out, or you're actually seeing some significant deviations in the movement patterns and you're having to get other muscle groups involved to do them. So Yeah, I think that was a really important thing you brought up, Zach.
I just got one thing to add before I forget it too, and this is really, really important. Another bone to kind of throw the anecdote is that I am aware of very few studies, like very few, so long as the volume is reasonable. Failure is almost never worse, and that's really,
Yes.
really important. So if you're talking to, if you're a personal trainer and you're trying to think about the big rocks for maybe a Gen Pop client, I think prioritizing proximity to failure is probably the standalone thing you can do for a Gen Pop client. Keeping the volume pretty low and just understanding that the adaptations for the most part in that instance are probably coming from proximity to failure. So manipulating set structure, loading range, repetition range, all that kind of stuff to allow them to reach a close proximity to failure with minimal discomfort is probably the way to go. So I think that's really, really important to state. The only instance that I'm aware of that's relatively consistent that failure or close to failure seems to be worse is for concurrent training. So you have a study by Carroll et al. That was it was a elaborate training program, a block periodized design, a lot of variables going on there. But the point being, one group training pretty close to failure, one group training pretty far for most of the training, but they were also doing sprint training. And there was only significant increases in the group training pretty far from failure, and the failure group actually didn't really grow much at all. So that's something to keep in mind. And then additionally, there was a new study that literally just came out by Held and colleagues that was like 65 milliliters per kg minute rowers, so pretty well-trained rowers that did one group training to failure with 80% of 1RM on all the big compound lifts, squat, bench, seal row, and deadlift, I remember, and one training to 10% velocity loss. So like we said, that's pretty far from failure with 80% of 1RM, and significantly greater strength gains across the board for pretty much all the lifts in the group training far from failure there. So concurrent training, maybe a slightly different story, but for most of the people in the iron cult, they probably can realize that when in doubt, training closer to failure is probably foolproof. It just comes when you take a step back and, like you said, Eric, look at this at a longer time frame in terms of fatigue management and effort under the curve. That's where I think you can start making arguments from more of a logistical perspective that training farther from failure might be want to be a little bit better. I got one more thing, but go for it if you guys want to ramble on that a little bit.
Well, the only thing I want to do is point out that you spoke to the Iron Cult shortly after quoting VO2 max scores without even prefacing it. Like, know your audience, bro. So,
Sorry.
I mean, come on. If you'd thrown around like, 200 kilos 1RM, it's like, oh, they got that, But this is 65 milliliters. Get out of here. All right, no, I'm serious. Continue on. Carry on. Keep going.
Yeah, and the last thing I was going to say is because we were just talking about the exercise selection, kind of the example you brought up was squats versus bench press or chest press versus leg extension. I think this is another example that I've kind of thought about recently that I think is probably a pretty big factor in this discussion. So, going back to Greg's article that kind of was a critique of the effective reps model. One of the things Greg kind of concluded that there seemed to be two groups. The studies that seemed to favor groups training close to failure, but they were also generally untrained subjects, versus the groups that were trained subjects generally performing multi-joint movements. So, that was Greg, obviously excellent writer, kept me up at night with that. I was trying to understand what the heck's going on here. And to kind of put the first piece in motion, I looked at the training status thing, and that didn't make a ton of sense to me from a mechanistic perspective, because when we look at something called voluntary activation, or essentially how well can a individual recruit the muscle mass that they have, that doesn't seem to change a ton in terms of training status. It might change a little bit here and there, but not a ton, not enough to make a huge difference in my opinion. So that part I was a little bit, weary on. The main thing I thought about was, I think the artifact here is that what untrained subjects call failure, again, going back to earlier in the conversation of definitions of failure, is considerably farther from failure than what actually we mean when we're on the gym floor. So that's kind of my reasoning there, probably why the disparity is there, whereas trained lifters have a better knowledge of what real failure is, quotes. So a 2 RIR for
I
them.
still struggle with it. Not to interrupt you, but the training status thing is frustrating for me. For one, the voluntary activation, sure. but you could go, oh, well, but motor learning is different. Even if voluntary activation is good, they're not synchronized well, so they're not going to be able to actually effectively train themselves. So that maybe that's why they have to go to failure. And I then think my immediate response to that is, okay, so they're not good at inducing a stress, but they shouldn't need to be because the threshold for adaptation is so low. Like training at 30% of 1RM to a low RPE should still be more than not doing anything. So I have a really I've always had a tough time, and having spoken to Greg, he noticed the pattern, but he wasn't like, and this is definitely what's going on.
Yeah, no, and that's my internal dialogue. I essentially was just going to say, I had these thoughts and I pretty much just crumpled that piece of paper and threw it away because I couldn't figure it out. So I moved to the other part of the equation, which was the single joint versus the multi-joint movement.
Yes.
And I think the easy thing to say there is, oh, okay, this is obvious. Squats are more fatiguing than bicep curls. So there it is. And while that makes sense to some degree, I don't know, especially when you look at some of the volumes used in these studies, I don't think it's a totally unreasonable training program. So I think that's definitely probably part of the equation, but I don't think that's the whole story. And so we had a lot of recent research that has looked at how muscle length seems to influence muscle growth. So there is like kind of one of the best studies on this topic was a study by Mako and colleagues, I believe is the lead author, that looked at hamstring curls. And they essentially saw a group training at a longer muscle length, or what's a good way to describe that?
A more stretched position.
There you go. Yeah. So the exercise is more challenging when the muscle is in a stretched position versus another variant of hamstring curl where it's more difficult in a shorter position or when your knee angle is a little bit more closed. And what they saw is the group training a longer muscle length saw pretty considerably better hypertrophy. And so I took that piece of information and I kind of was thinking about that a lot. And when you think about multi-joint versus single joint exercises, especially used in this area of the research, almost all multi-joint exercises are difficult in a stress position, whereas single joint exercises are difficult in a shortened position for the most part. The leg extension, bicep curl, and then for multi-joint lifts, squat, bench press, both of those are difficult in a lengthened position. So I think that is probably a mediating factor in why multi-joint lifts can be trained a little bit farther from failure. And if we think about the fatigue induced by those movements, that's probably also part of the equation because at a longer muscle length, you're probably causing a little bit more muscle damage on average. So I think that kind of all fits together a little bit in saying that, okay, that's probably an important thing to keep in mind. If we can get a better stimulus for longer muscle lengths, it just maybe the force produced on the fibers from those contractions allow us to stay a little bit farther from failure to elicit kind of the anabolic cascade biochemically.
I think you said that really well. I totally agree, and I do think that is a very large differentiating factor. For those who don't know, I had the pleasure of being on Zach's committee, and he brought that up in his defense in response to one of my questions. I think it's a very, very salient point. You did a great job on that, by the way. And just to kind of put this in practical terms, people know what he's talking about. If you think about the hardest point during a bicep curl, when you have the tendency to want to lean back, it's when your arm's at about 90 degrees, and that is like the midpoint. It's the mid-range of it. When you think about your standard leg extension, where they don't have an elliptical cam, or it's not loaded on one aspect or another, the hardest part is as you reach extension when the quad is in its most shortened position. However, on a bench press, where is it hardest? Right off your chest, where either the pec is elongated the most, and where is the squat the hardest? In the hole, when your quad is stretched the most, as are your glutes for that matter. So I think when you think about that, you can start to see what he's talking about, is that if we have different comparisons of types of exercises, and those also happen to have different proximities to failure, we can see these artifacts that are actually covariates that are influencing it, and we can make some of these possibly, we don't know for sure, incorrect conclusions as to what's going on. So I think really well said. Nice little take-home things you can learn from this discussion outside of proximity to failure is, hey, if you've got the option of a lying hamstring curl, or you've got the option of a seated hamstring curl, maybe jump on that seated bad boy, because you're basically in that kind of sit and reach position, and you're a little more stretched on the hammy, and that's exactly what that study found that he was bringing up. So yes, I think that is that was the big thing that I wanted to bring up, is that we actually have a whole lot more ambiguity on the topic related to exercise selection and which muscle groups we measure when we were talking about training to failure. And there's some indirect lines of research on this as well when we talk about synergists and the prime movers. I've seen EMG studies both on squats and bench press that show at relatively moderate loads, really far from failure. And Omar, you and I have talked about this before. You start to see some pretty high activation in the pecs and the quads, while you don't start to see the synergist go like, oh, I got to do something now, until you're closer to failure or using higher loads. So this tells you like, maybe that's why you see those really well-developed muscle groups in powerlifters, even if they train with a more Shaiko-esque style, because almost all those reps count for the prime mover, but maybe there's not as much, recruitment going on in the synergist. So I think that's a really, again, indirect work. EMG doesn't perfectly translate, but it makes a lot of sense, and it seems to fit in a nice coherence with all the other lines of research that we're looking at.
If I can pair a question back to you guys based on that kind of line of thinking, one thought I've had with that idea is, okay, let's say theoretically these synergist muscles do receive a greater stimulus training closer to failure. So triceps and the bench press, for example. Do you think that trade-off is the fatigue associated with training that close to failure is worth it for exercises that maybe you're not thinking about that as a tricep movement particularly? So obviously when you train a bench press, that's getting some sort of tricep stimulus, but from a holistic program design perspective, is it more favorable to leave a few more reps in reserve on my bench press, because that's for me a pec movement, and then then I can go way harder on my cable tricep extensions because that's ultimately what I'm using for my triceps? How do you guys kind of play that calculus out?
I'll tell you, the calculus for me basically works out quite well for power builders, quote unquote, because I actually do think that it makes more sense to shift to the movements where maybe you're not training at longer muscle lengths and then train closer to failure, because you can get the effects of high force outputs and all the proposed benefits of going close to failure without necessarily causing as much damage. And then it prevents there being an issue of doing that singlet of 5 or doing sets of low RPE but high force output sets that maybe don't give much of a stimulus to those synergist muscles. So you can train the pattern, minimize fatigue, get some good work in at high force outputs with that maximum intent to accelerate the bar, and then you can have your bro session on the isolation movements. And I think you can kind of get the best of both worlds. And that's something I don't just do with quote unquote power builders. That's something I do with my power lifters as well when they're further from comp. Obviously, there's an opportunity cost. I'm not going to be spending a lot of time on tricep pushdowns when they're 3 weeks out or 4 weeks out. But I think that is kind of a nice feature to this bug, if you will, that I think allows that to be, not always, but the better default position. That's me personally.
Yeah, I would just say quickly, in the context of the goal, dependent upon it, when Eric said power builder, lately I have certainly shifted more anecdotally, even for myself, getting the requisite skill practice, doing, let's say, the compound movement, but still leaving enough juice in the tank that if, I actually want to grow my triceps, going to an 8, going to a 9 at 70%, 75% versus actually choosing a movement that would probably have just more of a direct impact on my triceps, I'll tend to leave some of that fatigue off on the compound movement. And I just know, like, once again, in other ways, downstream effects, being fresher on than those sets, being more prepared, and all those other factors that come into what I'd regard as a higher overall quality in set session.
For sure.
And last thing I'd add is it also does depend on what do you got in the next 48 hours to do, right? Mm-hmm. So, for example, I have a session, my day 3. So right now I have a 5-day split. Day 1, I do squats just up to a single, and then bench with volume afterwards. Day 2, I do squats to a harder single, and then I do bench with no back off work, and then I have a day off, and I come back, and that's when I squat again. Or no, I got that wrong. But the point is, I can't remember my own split, folks. I don't squat on day 2. I squat on 1, 3, and 5. So I got that wrong. But I have that day where I do the bench just up to a single after the day I did bench and volume work afterwards. The single's at a relatively low RPE, and I know I'm going to be a little bit weaker on that day. Not a lot, it's just bench, but it's there. And you could go, oh, Eric, you just worked up to a 7 RPE on the bench. You'd be good and fresh to do some tricep pushdowns. Well, I don't want to, because the day after that is when I come in and I go for a high RPE bench. And I want to actually be fresh and be able to put a big number there. So I'd rather actually do the tricep pushdowns there, because on day 4 is the one day I don't bench. So I do think you have to think about that as well. Just because you have a bench set at a low RPE where you don't train the synergist doesn't mean that you're missing an opportunity to do tricep work afterwards. It depends on what you got later in the week. And there is always a trade-off. And I think sometimes you have to think about, well, maybe I need to make this one day really, really hard because I have 2 days off. So for example, I train on Saturday squat and bench, and I do back off sets on both. And then I do accessories for both after that. It's my hardest training day, but then I don't train again until Monday. And then it's that easier day again. So I think you do have to think about it from that perspective as well. And I think that's ultimately, just to kind of, maybe we can kick it over to Omar and talk about the psychology of people and the communication and the issue that's going on here. I think it's ultimately part of the problem is that people are just too short-term in their discussion. I think still, if you go to a commercial gym these days and you say, hey, what program are you running? They'll tell you a split. They'll tell you what they do Monday through Friday. And that, of course, is actually something I encourage. If you're not competing, if you're just training, like you don't want to make this complex, a bro split, now that we learned that frequency isn't quite as important, with sufficient volume where you're training to failure, that will get you the vast majority of your gains. Not everyone has to train like they're trying to qualify for nationals or get a pro card. I just know that a lot of our listeners do. So it becomes the issue of, are we talking about the same time scale? So anyway, that's my 2 cents there, maybe 4.
Man. No, I was going to say there's so much there, Eric and Zach. Just when we talk about the psychology of the average lifter, the context of the goal. So when you're talking, Zach, about different populations, so like Gen Pop, how they could benefit, they're habituating themselves to training and all these other factors, getting closer to proximity of failure could be a good thing. And then you talk about, like Eric jokes about, like, us, the masochists, like the lifelong lifters, where it's like, depending upon what training style you come from, what experience, your overall mindset, that there could be some benefit, one, to easing off the gas pedal a little bit, but within the greater context of your overall lifting, where I think if someone's only goal is to get swole versus as far as I'm concerned, once again, this can be self-selecting, like the people I talk to, the content I create, and all these other things, that swole is the goal, size the prize, but let's not get twisted. Getting stronger and some semblance of strength is there. And I think, therefore, if you are interested in getting stronger, you need to periodize your training a little bit more. And so the idea of just having simply a split, it's like, so wait, okay, so you have this split. So every single session, you have to think about the context of the training week itself. So if I go too hard on one session, my ability to recover for the next session will then be impacted. So how do I juggle all these things? But then also, if you're interested in, maybe you have secondary strength goals, or you're a power builder, or maybe you go a kind of block periodization where you do some hypertrophy kind of block, and then you do a strength block, you have to be thinking then about the mesocycle then. So not even like, session to session, but then week to week, what that's going to look like to aggregate the most amount of quality work. So I think once you start asking those questions, it's one of those things, when people say train harder, it sounds appealing, I think, because there's that internal narrative, one that we've been given by our society writ large, of like, work harder, you get better results, all those things. The masochism where it's like, I don't feel good about myself unless I'm not a good boy. I don't get the gold star next to my name. I don't get the cookie unless I really exerted myself, and by the end of it, I feel drained. So once again, it's a little bit ego serving rather than necessarily purposeful in terms of what we're doing. And I think if we reframe the conversation about all of us trying to get towards our goals and actually arriving there efficiently and making the most amount of progress, that you could start to rewire some of the associations of some of the words when we talk about harder, right? Like harder is better, more is better, the conversation of more is better. And that's why it's a meme in the music world, in the guitar space. But Eric, Yngwie Malmsteen says this thing where people say, he says less is more. So he's known for all his flurries of notes, the rapidity of what he plays, the legato, all these other things. And so people say like, hey, Yngwie, have you ever considered playing less notes? And he said, less is more often, like less is more in the context of music. And he's like, less is more? He's like, how does that even make sense? He says, more is more. And it's become kind of this meme of a particular attitude, right? So I think we're talking with attitudes, narratives, things that we've been conditioned. So the environment, and then you put that in the greater context of someone's goal and them arriving there and them thinking they are doing something that's getting them closer to their goal, the belief and all these other things. And man, it gets complicated. I will say just real quickly, and that's why I said at the start, Eric and Zach, man, people like to think, oh, you're in the cave, you can't reveal the truth to them, like the light's going to be too blinding. I think the Iron Cult is hip enough. I think strength athletes, I think it was you, Eric, that said that it's not controversial to talk about these things like proximity to failure and the greater context of getting stronger. You only have to take a look at the USAPL, like the observational evidence of all, like the best coaches, the coaching practices, and everything. I don't think it's controversial. I think it's when you start to
debate how to use RPE, not whether or not it should be used.
Right. I think it's when you start bridging that conversation over more to what I'd call Gen Pop lifters, and then getting swole, and then once again the marketing, like hey, like size splitting pumps and all these other things. Like, are you, man? I'll just say real quick, and then I want to hear Zach's opinion. But one of my favorite things there, because you were there, and actually Zach, you were there too, man, at Fortis Fitness when we talk about these internal narratives that are passed down, and we had Connor Heffernan to related over that, the history of marketing, Eric. At Fortis Fitness, the gym that I go to, Sean has gathered together, it's a collage of marketing throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And you'll notice similarities to modernity in terms of the language you use. You want to be astronaut tough. I got sand kicked in my face. Do you want to be a bigger man? You need like training harder. Like these are just some of the catch-all phrases because they're internally appealing because they sound right? They just sound self-evident. And so when you start unpacking all these things, I think all of our goals were united. It's serving the individual, trying to help them get to their goals. Man, there's so much to unpack, Eric.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of that stuff's super interesting. Is that wall right by the chalk bowl?
Yeah. What you on your weightlifting side when you were crushing them dead? It was there. Like I think you saw it like just in passing. Yeah, man.
I think I remember that now. Yeah, I think the two things I kind of wanted to hit on based on what you said, Omar, I think is always coming back to one of the primary training variables I always like to talk about is preference. Like I think that is something that's huge. If we've had this entire conversation about maximizing training quality, maximizing efficiency of training, I think doing stuff that you enjoy is going to be a huge part of that. So I think the main narrative I get from the proximity to failure research, in my opinion, is that it's flexible, especially for strength. Like there's a ton of different options, just like there is for loading, just like there is for, a ton of other of the variables that we've talked about over time. You don't have to just train in the 6 to 12 rep range for hypertrophy, and you don't have to just take it to failure. You have options based on your life context, your job. How do you enjoy to train? Do you enjoy running the rack on drop sets on bicep curls? You can do that. We got evidence to say that's effective. I think you can configure things in a way to align some of your preferences with this proximity to failure stuff to make sure you're still, kind of checking the boxes in terms of the overall tenets. So I think preference is super important. So I don't think you should take this evidence and just say, oh, okay, well, I have to do it this way. No, we're just saying it's super flexible and based on, are you kind of more strength focused on that spectrum of power building? Are you somebody who's way more hypertrophy focused and you enjoy training to failure? Maybe you're going to have a little bit more of that in your program, all that kind of stuff. But the other thing I was going to say is I think a lot of this maybe kind of narrative is left over from some of the old periodization stuff. So if we go back to kind of the DUP era, of the classic graph, right, where you got the undulation of the volume going down, intensity going up. I think now that we've broken that intensity line into two different pieces of load and proximity to failure, and we have this evidence in the constant discussion of volume is the primary driver of hypertrophy and strength. Volume is the primary. People hear it in their hallways at night as they're going to brush their teeth. They're thinking about it constantly. And so that drives people to say, man, I have to keep my volume high because I have these combined goals, right? And so that leads them, but I also want to get stronger, so intensity has to go up. So they have these things where the classic periodization literature, it's balanced, right? If you go and increase in intensity, you're going to have that decrease in volume. Well, now that we know that volume probably should stay relatively similar most of the time, if you have these combined goals, something has to go. And I think that's where you break those two lines apart. You have a nice steady decrease of proximity to failure now with the accompanied increase in load. That's where the flexibility comes back. And so you can keep that volume relatively high. And so those people that are pigeonholed with like those goals of, I want to get bigger and stronger, I think that's where the answer lies, instead of looking at things of, okay, I'm going 10 weeks out, 10 RM, 5 weeks out 5 RM, 2 weeks out 3 RM, and like they're training to failure the entire time or training super close to failure, just because that's how it's drawn up on paper on a lot of the older periodization stuff. So I think that's something to keep in mind and kind of helps soothe that narrative along for these people with kind of combined goals, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. That's well said. I think, I think in the scientific community, people hate the word narrative because it implies subjective interpretation and purposeful manipulation of the way that you're talking about data. But I think anytime it comes to scientific communication, it becomes a critical thing to consider. So when I discuss proximity to failure or RPE or anything like that, I always come at it from the angle of improving performance, because that's typically what we share, even if we're diverging. And that is true whether someone is a recreational or competitive lifter. And I think so long as the person knows their audience and can modify the level of complexity to the needs of the individual listening, you're probably going to do okay. Because this is one that right now just it seems to have people talking across each other a lot. So hopefully we can get around that. And I think, we can't be surprised by it, given we started this conversation with there being differing definitions even within the scientific community itself.
100%.
Yeah. So we've covered a lot of ground, gentlemen. I really like where we've taken it. One small other tangent that I thought worth bringing up that you reminded me of when you talked about that within subject design study by, I believe, Anderson. There was another within subject design study that came out I can't remember when it came out. It was relatively recent, where they looked at different frequencies. And they found...
DAMAS.
Yeah. Yes, DAMAS. Thank you. And they actually found some really big individual differences as far as who responds better to lower or higher frequencies. And my suspicion is that this might be related to the time course of recovery. And time course of recovery is intrinsically attached to proximity to failure. We have a lot of data. Some of it came out of Spain, like we were talking about, where same volume, different proximity to failure, and you're adding maybe 24 to 48 hours on certain recovery markers before they get back to baseline. So in this consideration of understanding that frequency has individual variation, and knowing that most training studies actually are defaulted to let's train to failure, those are probably one and the same. And that people's individual differences in frequency are at least somewhat a function of their individual differences in time course of recovery, which are heavily influenced by proximity to failure, which means this whole thing of, go with your preference is not just a question of what do you like to do and are you a bro at heart or not, but really it might actually come down to individual differences that are measurable. And it's not just you could run the rack or you could do some sets to 5, but you, not the global we of the mean and standard deviation, might benefit more from one or the other. So it means that it encourages paying attention, it encourages self-experimentation, and ideally, please folks listen to this, it encourages not putting your own experience onto others, because someone else will get benefits from doing something quite different. So just to put that out there, like my own, if I have done this, if I take my own personal experience too far, I have done daily max benching followed by 3 sets of 8 to 12 to failure 5 days a week, and I'm really never that sore.
I did the same thing.
And that's me. So I know that for certain muscle groups, certain movements, the recovery time is short. The amount of fatigue I can do, even within the context of normal or even relatively extreme training, is not that bad. So it makes sense for me to pursue a higher frequency, higher volume program. But that does not necessarily mean that approach will be the same for everyone else. In fact, I've seen that not be the case. And I've engaged with people whose anecdotes are the polar opposite. And that's not that one of our worldviews or perspectives is right or wrong. It's that we're different.
Absolutely. And this is going to sound somewhat nihilistic too, but this is really important too, I think, when we're looking at the scientific research in aggregate. I think proximity to failure is hugely important because it shapes every single other variable in terms of recommendations. And that's where I think it really is important to grasp that and understand the uncertainty in that measurement and the way that we define it and the way that the groups in every single training study we do, even when they're training at the same proximity to failure, the way that that's all defined. If every single group in the volume studies, for example, all train to failure, that's going to influence the recommendations that we get from meta-analyses. So it's just like it's permeated literally in every single thing that we do in all these training studies, even the load for strength. If we're training to failure on all of those, that might also impact the load that can be benefited from. So I just think it's important to understand, like you said, that not only is it extremely individual, but that's also going to shape the rest of our recommendations, which is why, standard caveats apply that science is a starting point, and then your individual data and individual response will supersede that. But yeah, I think that's just something to keep in mind too, that proximity to failure literally is impacted every other variable that we kind of use the science to prescribe a starting point, including frequency and volume, like that DAMA study looks at.
That's why we ignore the science, folks. Just go with our feelings. Nihilism and Paimon be praised. Excuse me. So yeah, we don't know anything. Welcome to Iron Culture.
We know
Hope
that.
you've enjoyed the last 130 episodes that were a waste of your time.
So yeah, there's some real interest about, hey, shit, bro, who really knows? It doesn't really matter anyways. All right, peace.
Pretty much.
And that's where someone says, who is just like not even remotely listening, but they just hear the soundbite. See, I told you. Those science tards, those three guys who don't even look like they lift. I'm like, oh, here we go. Oh yeah, here we go.
This is another tangent, but that the post that you mentioned, Eric, I think it was a comment about that kind of concept that struck home, kind of the confusion going back and forth, because that is kind of what we just talked about. We just had a very lengthy discussion about how proximity to failure matters and all this stuff, and then ultimately this cap of uncertainty of it also impacts everything else. So there's a little bit of wiggle room. So I think that's important to state too, that it's a starting point, and then from there having a solid process to kind of navigate the cave, as you guys like to say often. I think that's a good way to think about it.
Man, keep those pen light batteries charged, folks.
Amen.
That's all you got. I feel like, Omar, this is probably the most any podcast had gone in on failure to this date yet. Do you agree? And with the same grammatical structure, I need you to speak.
Yeah. I was gonna start, and then I was like, Eric, I
can't do it.
I have to be unabashed though, because the thing is, it's not comparative to me, Eric, of us versus anyone else, because we're atop the pyramid. I will say this within the context of Iron Culture. This absolutely has turned into a pillar episode, however you want to phrase it, where it's one of those required listening episodes, regardless of kind of what your goal is. It was hit so out of the park. Zach, I think you did a fantastic job. I think this conversation went everywhere and anywhere that it should have gone, that it's required listening. And so it just has become one of those
immigration.
things. Yeah. Hey, Eric kicked it off in a non-controversial way. They just said everyone's not in agreement. Okay, let's go. But I do really think it's one of those episodes that people will refer back to. And I think that's great, because I think it pushes the ball forward, to your point, Eric, where you're talking about like science communicators and people, how they want to absorb things and they're not reading the primary sources. This, I think, will be bridging the gap, so to speak, an episode for those people that kind of understand some of these things superficially about proximity to failure, but want to know more, to not solidify their beliefs, but to better inform their own training. And I think that's really all our conversations, how we frame it, at least around here. And Zach, you're the homie, you're the person who made the cave reference. Mike T, shout out to Mike T for simultaneously the most nihilistic, but also in ways most uplifting, because it's like it's self-determinism, where it's like, well, I got the pen light, Eric. Like I got the pen light. I'm going somewhere. So yeah, everything's dark. Okay, cool, whatever. I don't know where I am. I don't know what's gonna happen.
Yes, this is the hardest game ever made, set on the hardest difficulty, but it's still possible to win.
Yeah, exactly. And I do think arming people with the opportunity to better understand themselves and their training and the choices they make is all we aspire towards. So whenever we hit it kind of there, Eric, and I like to think, hey, it happens. We have a fantastic guest. I'm just happy. I'll say this, because I actually think there's so much to unpack in this episode. I think it might be an episode people listen to 1, 2, or 3 times. There was a few places where I thought, like, oh, we kind of go here. It's like, but we covered so much.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you could write a whole master's thesis on. So
don't remind me.
so
but not a PhD.
No, if someone's to go on and do a PhD on that, I think it'd be a waste of their time, really. No, but in all seriousness, future PhD failure. Zach,
Absolutely.
You did a great job on this. Please tell us, for all the folks who want to learn even more, understand the applications of this, which I think you do a great job of with your data-driven strength posts and articles, where can they find you?
Yeah, so you can read more about our stuff at data-drivenstrength.com if you want to kind of look at some articles we've written and on the topic. And then also on Instagram, like you said, most of us post some infographics and stuff about studies. So it'd be my name, Zach, our other team members' names, Josh or Jake, .data-driven strength on Instagram, and you can find our stuff there.
Thank you so much, dude. And we'll definitely
appreciate both of you guys.
We'll definitely say we'll put that in the description, and then we might or may not. But they listen.
Totally fine.
So if we know everyone listens to the last few minutes, so expect your IG to blow up from this episode big time.
We won't shout it out in the intro, certainly. But I was genuinely, Zach, it's been fantastic to see you once again. And now, wow, what a topic to cover in 3-4 short years. My man is out here just challenging the normative standards that most lifters have when it comes to the lifting, just completely removing the carpet underneath them. So we will make sure to link your social media in the description, as well as your boys with a Z, yes, at the end. And if anyone's listening, they made it all the way to the end, they could do us a favor by helping us out against, the encroaching darkness, and that is leaving a rating and review on iTunes. It cleanses the soul. And if it's not 5 stars, Eric, like if you're thinking to yourself, hey, yeah, I enjoyed it, but not really, don't even bother. It's not worth your time. So let's get that pentagram going. Let's get 5 stars happening. Thank you so much for everyone listening to this episode. We'll be back with another one every single Monday.